Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to our program today. It's the launching of the Rockbund Art Museum Spring Program. And the program that you are seeing today and its exhibition upstairs on the 3rd floor and also on the 4th and the 5th floor are a part of the multi-year research direction of the museum, the complex geographies. So the complex geographies as a research direction, it starts with China Journal as the first chapter, which is really closely connected to the legacy of the building. So the legacy of the building is that the Royal Asiatic Society, who inhabited the building before we did as a museum. And so China Journal, it takes the name of the journal that is published by this Royal Asiatic Society in 1923. And many of the theses and papers that was published in the journal were first shared at this very auditorium. And that's why we're taking the name of the auditorium for this floor as well. So the journal and also the library on the 3rd floor, which you will see an exhibition that is heavily related to the archive of the building, also the Royal Asiatic Society, as well as all the scholarly explorations and disseminations of knowledge about China, is also something that we're doing with the program at the auditorium this year. So the auditorium was originally established in 1933, and it was called Wu Lien-teh Auditorium. And the space was the focal point for the Royal Asiatic Society members to gather and to discuss things, to also share new research to each other. So reimagined in 2024, auditorium pays this homage to the historical roots of our history and also of the building. And the space that you are in right now is installation by Singaporean artist based in Berlin called Ming Wong. And the installation is called the Scenography for a Shanghai Science Fiction Opera. So Ming is somebody who is very known for the exploration of the structure and also social context of film and theatrical, and also with a very strong focus on the traditional Chinese opera. So in this installation that you see the clouds that was taken from the Buddhist cave and the motifs, but also the science fiction interior taken from Soviet science fiction films. So what we are doing here is we're kind of rooted from the history and we're exploring the future together. We're collectively trying to build memories and also build conversations and dialogues together. So this is the core of the activities at Auditorium, which is a really dynamic approach to the act of study, which we're prioritizing motion and also circulation, redistributions of learning and studying together. And so this year-long auditorium program is also led by the polyvocal curatorial visions of the team together. And every month we'll be focusing on different focus. So this month, March, we're focusing on artistic research. And also we are starting from our locality, Shanghai, as well. So we're looking at Shanghai from questions that is related to social, cultural, technological, economic, and also historical contexts. So today, what we are bringing to you is artist Ho Rui An and curator and writer Chen Xian's research and also their project Spinning Time. And the way that we are doing this program is that we're presenting artistic research that is really closely interrelated to their practice. So this is an ongoing project and practice that the two of them has been doing for a while. And what you are seeing today is a performance lecture. And in this performance lecture, Ho Rui An and Xian is going to be looking at textile mills and its history. And currently, they are doing research in Shanghai in the Dinghaiqiao area, which is where the textile mills were once really established as an important industrial center for Shanghai as well as for China. So they're focusing on questions concerning labor, specifically female labor, machinic, capital, and also socio-technical aspects of the mills. So without further ado, I'll also introduce Rui An and Xian. Rian is a Singaporean artist who currently works and also lives in Singapore, and he works at the intersection of contemporary art, cinema and performance, and also theory. And across the mediums of lectures, essays, his research examines systems of governance in a global age. And he's currently in the Shanghai Biennial, but he's also been in solo exhibition at Kunsthaus Wien, Center A in Vancouver, and he has presented projects at UC Zian Art Museum, Contemporary, Eindhoven Van Abbey Museum, NTU Center of Contemporary Art in Singapore, Parasite, Hong Kong, and he's also participated biennials apart from Shanghai in Bangkok, Taichung, Guangzhou, Jakarta, Sharjah, and Koji, Missouri. And Zian Chen is currently the contributing editor of Ocular Magazine's Chinese platform. And his collaborative research and curatorial projects with artists have been presented at institutions such as the Power Station of Art in Shanghai, Ming Contemporary Art Museum Shanghai, Times Museum in Guangzhou, and NIDA Art Colony in Lithuania, and the Bleed Biennial in Melbourne. And he's also contributed to exhibition catalogues for artists such as Mark Dian, Arseny Zelayan, Elmgreen and Draxler, Wong Tor, and institutions including the Liverpool Biennial and Asia Art Biennial. So Zian and Rian, I'll cover the stage.
In the early days of the pandemic in April 2020, I received an invitation from the Center of Heritage Arts and Textile, also known as CHAT, to participate in its residency program the following year. CHAT is located at the former spinning mills of Nantong Textiles in Hong Kong, and they had reached out to me hoping that I would be interested in researching the city's industrial heritage. At that time, I had just concluded a body of research around the so-called East Asian miracle, which refers to the rapid economic growth achieved between the 60s and the 90s by the four Asian dragons that included South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. For many of these economies, the textile industry played a significant role in propelling this economic expansion, often by combining cheap labor with imported machinery to mass-produce commodities for export. Given that the textile industry was at one point by far the largest industry in Hong Kong, this model was observable within the then British colony more than in anywhere else. However, it was only when I arrived in Hong Kong that I realized how little traces remain of the industry. Much like Singapore, Hong Kong's shift from an export-oriented industrial economy to one that can be characterized as post-industrial was well underway as early as the late 1980s. Today, both cities are renowned global financial hubs. Yet, to speak of the post-industrial, a process of deindustrialization must have first taken place, of which the images that immediately come to mind are abandoned factories and dilapidated former industrial towns, resulting either from the offshoring of manufacturing jobs to lower-wage countries, as seen in the Rust Belt in the US, or from the privatization of socialist state enterprises, as seen in parts of northeastern China. In cities like Singapore and Hong Kong, however, so complete is the transformation of the economic base that one struggles to even locate any industrial ruins that remain within the urban landscape. So my research in Hong Kong began with the process of looking for the remnants of a history that has so quickly come to pass. Where else could I have begun but at Tuguawan, the site where many of Hong Kong's first cotton mills were first established in the late 1940s. We asked Timothy, a local guide of the area, to give us a tour and introduce some of the historical sites. However, the problem was that very little remains of the area's industrial history. In fact, Timothy told us that the land upon which we were standing as we looked onto the harbor did not even exist back then, having been reclaimed in the 1960s and 70s. To help us better grasp the extent of these changes, Timothy brought along a folder of old photographs to show us how the area used to look, and used a laser pointer to indicate the approximate location of the various sites he mentioned. But because some of these sites were too far from where we were standing, he directed the laser beam towards a wire fence that was right in front of us, using it as a projection surface for the beam to land. Looking at the moving speck of green light, I started thinking of the fence as a kind of cinematic device that makes visible a line connecting two different places and two different times. Here and there, present and past. And it was from this intermittently visible green point that I began a process that would take me from one river delta region to another, as I, along with my collaborators, pursued the lines that stretch over a century of industrial history, beginning along the banks of one Huangpu River in 1895.
In the 1890s, just as textile products were overtaking opium as China's largest import, the Shanghai Machine Weaving Bureau officially began production. As an emblem of this self-strengthening movement during the final decades of the Qing dynasty, the cotton mill was located on Yangshupu Road by the Huangpu River, which later developed into Shanghai's most important industrial belt. From the outset, the mill was established as a monopoly through a policy put forward by the reformist official Li Hongzhang that prohibited private businessmen from opening any new textile mill for the next 10 years. However, this changed with the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki in the aftermath of the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, which opened Shanghai to a new wave of foreign businessmen setting up textile mills in the city. In that year, Zhang Zhidong, another leading figure of the self-strengthening movement, he faced a similar predicament, having failed to attract the required capital for the Hubei Weaving Bureau. He could only store the imported machinery along the banks of the Huangpu River. There, as he worried about the heavy debt he had incurred for purchasing the machines, Zhang Zhidong began to contemplate the potential of the strip of the land before him. Since the 19th century, the Taiping Rebellion had led to an influx of refugees into Shanghai Concession, causing the price of the land on the Bund to skyrocket tenfold and new settlements to emerge along the banks. Sensing the opportunity for a new source of government revenue, Zhang Zhidong quickly imposed a riverfront land tax that he then used to clear his debts. As for the machines themselves, it would take another 2 years before they were salvaged from their deepening state of disrepair. In 1897, after the intervention of different authorities, half of the machinery was finally sold for $500,000 taels worth of official shares to a cotton mill that was being set up to the north of the Yangtze River, in the area known today as Nantong. Situated in the northern suburbs of present-day Nantong, Dasheng Cotton Mill was founded by local scholar-turned-industrialist Zhang Jian, and is known today as one of the first Chinese-owned joint stock companies in the country. Given the numerous difficulties Zhang Jian faced in attracting funds for what was seen as a risky venture of setting up industry in a rural setting, the arrival of the shipment of machines from Shanghai was a godsend. It was only then when the machine was fully unloaded and inspected, it became apparent that years of abandonment in a humid environment had turned them rusty and damaged, and it would make much repair before merely less than half of the spindles could be put to work. In search of what remains of these over century-old machines, we found ourselves at the Nantong Textile Museum. There, we met the recently retired department head, Li Yuqun, who gave us a tour of the workshop where some of these machines have been preserved and put on display. She shared that back then, a British engineer had accompanied these machines to Nantong and stayed on years until they were fully installed and in operation. To accommodate him, Zhang Jian even built an exclusive residence for him next to his office building. But even after production began, at the turn of the 20th century, it would soon become clear that despite the importation of machines and experts from Western industrial centers, the form of industrial capitalism that eventually emerged in the region would take a historical course very different from that of the West. And as for those rusty machines, despite the salvage efforts, their initial exposure to the moisture given from the Huangpu River will cast a long shadow on the future of the mill.
In 1899, the year that Dasheng No. 1 cotton mill commenced production, a clock tower was erected at the front gate of the factory premises. Traditionally a cotton-producing region populated by small peasant communities, the area that falls within the boundaries of present-day Nantong would by the 1920s become a global cotton spinning hub, almost entirely as a result of the success of the Dasheng system and the man with which it is almost singularly identified, its founder, Zhang Jian. While today the legacy of Zhang Jian has gained official recognition, as best seen in the numerous monuments built in his honor, nothing about this emergence of industrial capitalism in late Qing China had come naturally. Not only did Zhang Jian have to leverage his political and commercial networks to secure the required capital, as well as import foreign machines and experts, he also had to turn a population of peasants into industrial workers. And to do so, he had to transform something very fundamental to our very existence, the concept of time itself. This is because there can be no industrial capitalism without wage labor, and no wage labor without labor time, and no labor time without time as dictated by the mechanical clock. For it was only by the count of the clock that workers knew when to enter and leave the factory that served as the engine of capitalism. The clock tower at Dasheng No. 1 cotton mill, an object rarely seen in China outside of the much more cosmopolitan Shanghai, can therefore be said to remind workers not just of the time of the day, but also that they were entering the time of capitalist modernity. However, the irony is that one of the secrets to the initial success of Dasheng was that it had at its disposal a different, more ancient concept of time. Unlike in other parts of the world, the rise of the textile industry in the urban centers of the Yangtze Delta region did not fundamentally transform the rural peripheries through a shift towards large-scale industrial farming. Instead, up until the reform era, vast pools of surplus labor in the villages continued to subsist by supplying industrial mills with cheap raw cotton picked through small-scale farming. What's even more remarkable is that with the advent of machine spinning, the yarn produced by industrial mills was sold back to the villages to be woven into cloth, once more within peasant households, where cheap foot-pedaled wooden looms continued to be used even after more efficient iron-geared looms became widely available. Here, the condition that kept labor costs low enough to disincentivize capital investment was precisely the availability of a non-capitalist sense of time. Wherever cotton cultivation and cloth weaving remained a low-paying activity, it was primarily women and children who were deployed during their free time, or the time that was left over after each household had met their consumption needs. Outside of the pressures of the wage economy, where there was always something else you could do with your time, the auxiliary labor performed by these seemingly otherwise non-productive subjects, typically during the off-season from November to April, came at a low opportunity cost, and could therefore be sustained at a very poor level of remuneration. Jiang Chen himself was deeply conscious of these advantages, as seen in how he gave his workers time off to pick cotton during the harvest season. More tellingly, Jiang Tian's most significant investments in the countryside came not in the form of production machinery, but in land improvement through massive reclamation projects that turned the saline soil along the coastline into cultivable land for crop production by tenant family farms. As we learned from Huang Weiren, an independent researcher of Zhangjian and native of the reclamation area, this conversion of vast salt fields owned by the Qing government for crop cultivation was highly unorthodox, given that the government's monopoly on salt historically accounted for its chief source of revenue. If not for the political capital accrued by Zhang Jian during his tenure as salt minister, it is unlikely that the transformation of the Subei hinterland into a zone of extraction to meet the needs of the burgeoning industrial economy could have happened at all. Such connections would also play a part in allowing Zhang Jian to retain near complete control over the numerous enterprises he would later set up as extensions of the cotton spinning business. This included 3 companies set up within the same year, namely the Guangsheng Oil Mill, Dasheng Steamship Company, and the Tonghai Land Reclamation Company, all of which were majority owned not by Zhang Jian, but by merchant investors. However, as we shall see, this highly personalized mode of control would ultimately not be able to overcome the contradictions inherent to the alliance between the ambitious reformer of a declining imperial order and the rising class of merchant capitalists seeking the quickest return on their investment. Despite initially providing the conditions for the Dasheng system to flourish, such an unusual pairing would also in time result in its undoing.
In 1902, Rong Zhongjing and Rong Deshen, better known as the Rong brothers, opened their first industrial flour mill in Wuxi, a city to the west of both Shanghai and Nantong. The outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War merely 2 years later proved to be an incredible business opportunity, allowing them to reap handsome profits by meeting the urgent demand of food in northeast China. Meanwhile, in Nantong, the Dasheng system expanded into the flour industry with the establishment of the Fuxing flour mill in 1909. Following the textile business model of sourcing cotton locally, the flour mill also brought wheat from local farmers, from which they produced flour that was then bagged in cheesecloth made from the yarn spun by the adjacent cotton mill. An inverse process took place across the Yangtze. When beginning in 1915, the Rong brothers used the funds from their flour mill in Wuxi to invest in textile factories in Shanghai. This move also marks a step away from their familial circle into the international networks of speculative capital. Nothing best demonstrates this financialized connection between flour and cotton than the view of their 2 factories along Moganshan Road in Shanghai. On one side sits the cotton mill, and on the other, the flour mill. The end of World War I in 1918 delivered a blow to Chinese-owned cotton and flour businesses. However, this situation did not proceed for long. With the launch of the May 4th movement in 1919, in protest of the Japanese occupation of Shandong, the boycotts of Japanese goods and waves of nationalism that followed will again allow domestic brands such as those owned by the Rong family to flourish. Remarkably, throughout these booms and busts, the Rong business empire, which remained highly leveraged, continued to pursue different mergers and acquisitions, eventually allowing it to take up more than 20% of the country's production capacity at its height.
In 1922, a convention planned by Zhang Jian to take place in the fall to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the birth of the so-called Nantong model of local self-government was abruptly cancelled. A direct result of the Dasheng system's mounting financial difficulties. The decision to cancel the convention was made after the cotton mills went into heavy debt when over 2 decades of almost uninterrupted growth came to a halt in 1921. While much blame could be attributed to a devastating flood that took place the previous year, the mill's turn of fortunes was already sealed at least a decade back. In the 1910s, Zhang Jian's control over the land that had been brought into cultivation through his reclamation program quickly dwindled after merchant shareholders passed a policy to sell the reclaimed land as soon as it was cultivated. Left with barely enough land to supply its needs, the company was eventually forced to purchase cotton from merchant firms. The loss of this key advantage was compounded by the falling productivity of the mill's worn-out machinery. Having built his business empire primarily on the extraction of the countryside, Zhang Jian, like many other Chinese mill owners, did not invest much in the replacement and maintenance of its aging machines. It was thus only a matter of time that the foreign companies re-entering the Chinese market after the war would outproduce the mill under the Dasheng system. Within Nantong itself, the high-count, high-quality yarn produced using cutting-edge technology by Japanese companies quickly displaced Dasheng cotton, Dasheng yarn as the choice of local weavers. Unable to reverse its downward spiral, the company was finally taken over by a consortium of Shanghai banks in 1925. More than in any other place, it was in Shanghai where one could observe the superiority of a more capitalized form of industrialization over the relatively feudal variety of industrial capitalism that was practiced in Nantong. And nowhere was this process made easier than in the film industry, whose birth and development in Shanghai unfolded in tandem with the rise of the textile industry. As early as 1926, the scale of production in Shanghai's cotton mills can already be seen in the silent film A String of Pearls, which features an extended shot of a bustling spinning workshop. In an obvious homage to Lumiere's seminal film, the film also features a shot of workers entering the factory. Yet, if in this latter shot, the choice to film the workers entering rather than leaving the factory also marks a departure from the Lumiere brothers' original image. We are also left with the question of what a scene of workers leaving the Shanghai cotton mill would look like. And where exactly would these workers go after leaving the factory? The reality that is not depicted by the films produced during this period for a mostly bourgeois audience is that the workers had likely left the factory to go on a city-wide strike. Indeed, just 1 year before A String of Pearls was released, the May 30th movement had broken out in Shanghai after the fatal shooting of a textile worker, Gu Zhenhong, triggered unrest across the city. Today, this event has been officially recognized as a key turning point for the workers' movement in Shanghai that paved the way for the city's liberation by the Communist Party over 2 decades later. However, within this narrative, before the workers could go on strike, they had to first go somewhere else, namely the West Shanghai Workers' Half-Day School, established in 1920 by Communist Party cadres. This workers' half-day school located along the Suzhou Creek not only provided workers with basic education and taught them literacy. It was also where they were first exposed to Marxist ideology. Today, this history is recounted in a museum built near the site of the original workers' half-day school, wherein the narrative begins with the workers' encounter of the magazine New Youth published by Chen Duxiu, one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party. Yet, ironically, it was Chen Duxiu himself who expressed in an article published in New Youth in 1920 that although Shanghai appears to be where the majority were proletarians, the conditions for revolution could not be found. As he observed, this was because it was neither the capitalist class nor the government that directly controlled most of the workers, but the Green Gang, the most powerful underworld organization in the city at the time. Indeed, as the key power brokers in a city of immigrants without a single unified administration, gangsters were crucial as mediators between labor and capital and as contractors that ensured the continuous flow of workers from the villages to the city. Even the Communist Party's success in the labor movement of the 1920s was partly the result of their integration of gangsters and other underworld figures in this highly fragmented world of labor. They often did so by first bringing leaders of different native place gangs into their cause, while building on existing forms of solidarity, such as brotherhoods and secret oaths. It seems then that to know how workers could be successfully mobilized in early 20th century Shanghai, one should start not at the half-day school to which they went after leaving the factory, but at the point where they left the factory and entered the different feudal networks they would have to first traverse before they could even be in a position to receive an education in Marxist ideology.
In 1928, as relations between the nationalist Kuomintang and the Communist Party came to a violent end, Soviet left-wing filmmaker Yakov Belyo produced the documentary Shanghai Document, using footage shot by cameramen in Shanghai. Among its most startling revelations were the images of child labor in the city's textile mills, presented on screen for the first time. Produced at the height of the left-wing movement and against the tumultuous labor unrest unraveling across the city, the film climaxes with a chilling scene of communists being executed by the Kuomintang following the rise to power with the support of the Green Gang. Given the political climate of the time, Shanghai Document never made its way to the big screen in China. Nonetheless, a new wave of left-wing literary and artistic practices will quickly follow, this time led by local cultural figures. In 1932, Japanese air raids destroyed many cotton mills on the north bank of the Suzhou Creek. Unexpectedly, this caused thousands of child laborers to pour into the refugee camps located in the international settlement, bringing the scale of the problem to light for the first time. The turmoil that ensued compelled Shanghai left-wing writer Xia Yan to write the film Shanghai 24 Hours, based on the news reports of child labor, and it was soon released the following year. In order to get a more accurate sense of the conditions on the ground, Xia Yan also worked night shifts in textile mill for several weeks, even twice sneaking into the workers' dormitories to conduct interviews. In 1936, the groundbreaking expose, Baoshengong, or Contract Labor in English, was published using the material he gathered. Unlike their colleagues who were free to go wherever they wanted after leaving the factory, there was not a moment when these workers, many of whom were young girls, left the despotic regime of their gang-affiliated contractors. According to Xia Yan's report, contract workers were often brought into the city as children by contractors who purchased them from their parents in the village. Once in Shanghai, they had no option but to live in housing run by the local gang and could only receive their wages through their contractors, who even appropriated part of what they earned. In this world of bonded labor, such is the power of gangsters that even when it came to the task of overthrowing the capitalist class, one had to first enlist them to the cause. Indeed, the eventual success of the Communist Party in Shanghai will hinge upon the gangsters' change of allegiance as the Kuomintang government faced its moment of reckoning in the late 1940s.
On January 30, 1948, workers at Shanghai's Shenzhen No. 9 cotton mill began a factory-wide strike to protest salary arrears against the background of escalating inflation caused by the mismanagement of the Kuomintang government. Part of the system of cotton mills founded by Rong Zhongjing and Rong Desheng, Shenzhen No. 9 cotton mill had at one point reportedly employed a workforce of which over a third were gang-affiliated contract workers. This division resulted in a fractured union where Kuomintang affiliates competed against gangsters as well as a small number of underground Communist Party members for leadership over the workers' movement. Despite the contradictions within the movement, the workers were able to put up a fiery resistance during the ensuing military crackdown by using bricks, iron bars, and other fixtures from the factory to fend off the armored vehicles, although they eventually came up short. 3 years later, in the context of a liberated Shanghai, these events were reenacted at their original location in the film United Until Tomorrow, which emphasized the communist leadership of the strike. Reflecting a trope that recurs across films set in the textile industry made during the period, the film shows the entrance of the cotton mill transformed into a literal and ideological battlefield where workers gain class consciousness and fight to reclaim their rightful place as workers, as the owners of the factory. In the climactic scene, the workers even seal the factory gate from the outside to prevent the products of their labor from being expropriated by the Kuomintang forces. The film ends with the liberation of Shanghai through a sequence of celebratory scenes that affirm the official narrative that it was less skilled women workers who led the revolutionary struggle in the city. In truth, however, the Communist Party branch at the Shenzhen No. 9 cotton mill was led by a male metal worker, with the strike headquarters located in the machine shop. Moreover, the Communist Party had earlier identified the revolutionary potential of Shenzhen No. 9 cotton mill precisely because, compared to other cotton mills, a larger proportion of its workforce were better educated mill workers that increasingly made up the party's base. Partly because these were the workers who enjoyed the most autonomy from gang-controlled networks. In fact, the Communist Party's eventual success at winning over the broader labor movement resulted as much from its own organizational strengths as from the defection of many underworld leaders to the party when it became clear that the Kuomintang government was on its last legs. After all, the only alternative that these gangsters had was to leave the country altogether. And for those who did, many of them chose the same destination to which most of Shanghai's industrial capitalist class would move: Hong Kong. In the summer of 1946, amidst the turmoil of the Chinese Civil War, cotton mill owners in Shanghai began moving their operations to Hong Kong. Over the next 2 years, tens of thousands of spindles and looms that were originally due to arrive in Shanghai were diverted to Hong Kong instead. Given that the Kuomintang government had blocked all imports of machinery, Shanghai capitalists had no alternative. Hong Kong was far from the ideal destination for the relocation of Shanghai's textile industry. The hot and humid climate was not conducive for the operation of the machines, while the city lacked a readily available pool of skilled workers. However, these problems were quickly resolved by the first companies to arrive through the introduction of air conditioning and the transfer of seasoned workers from Shanghai to train the local population. By 1949, on the eve of the communist takeover of Shanghai, almost a dozen new textile mills had already been established by Shanghai capitalists in Hong Kong, among which was Nanyang Cotton Mills, founded in Tuguawan as the city's first vertically integrated cotton mill. Nanyang Cotton Mills was founded by Rong Hongqing, the youngest son of Rong Zhongjing, who himself immigrated to Hong Kong in the 1930s amidst the Civil War. However, even as a part of them moved south, the remaining members of the Rong family announced in a Wuxi newspaper on March 15, 1949, that the Shenzhen system operating in Wuxi and Shanghai will never be moved abroad. From that point on, one of China's richest industrial families will be straddled across two river delta regions, binding the two regions through lines of capital that will be interrupted but never completely broken by the turbulent events of the coming years.
In the 1950s, just as the Communist Party was still figuring out its path to economic development, relations with the capitalist world quickly broke down when China entered the Korean War. As tensions mounted between the two sides of the Cold War, the economic blockade imposed by the US on China in retaliation only strengthening the alliance between China and the Soviet Union. This is reflected in the first five-year plan launched in 1953 that featured investment in the infrastructure and technological transfers from the Soviet Union, targeting several key industries, including textiles. Of the many collaborations that followed between the two countries, the most visually arresting were a series of Soviet-style exhibition halls, where impressive showcases of Soviet industrial achievements were mounted to provide a glimpse into what socialist industrialization might entail for China. The first in the series, the Soviet Exhibition Hall, was built in 1954 in Beijing. In the following year, its successor, the Sino-Soviet Friendship Building, was completed in Shanghai. The subsequent period would see the opening of the Sino-Soviet Friendship Building in Guangzhou and the Sino-Soviet Friendship Palace in Wuhan. But in a reflection of the changing winds within the Soviet Union, the more grandiose Stalinist architectural feature sported by their predecessors were absent in the last two buildings. Predictably, as the de-Stalinization movement gathered pace in the Soviet Union, China-Soviet relations quickly deteriorated not long after the completion of all four buildings. It was also at the juncture that the Chinese economy began facing major problems. After having nationalized almost all the means of production, the country was faced with rising debts and a shortage of foreign exchange that will only be worsened by the impending withdrawal of Soviet aid. It was in response to this predicament that in the spring of 1957, the Sino-Soviet Friendship Building in Guangzhou hosted the first Chinese export commodities fair, later better known as the Canton Fair. But besides these economic imperatives, the leadership in Beijing also drew upon their experiences with several trade missions to deduce that expanding trade with capitalist nations in Europe, especially Britain, could help foster division between Washington and its allies. In fact, on the eve of the fair's opening, exemptions being granted to steel manufacturers in Japan, and at least 10 European countries were already allowing them to export in limited quantities to China in a threat to the US-led embargo. With more firms demanding greater access to the Chinese market, it did not take long for the Canton Fair to quickly grow to account for up to 2/3 of the country's exports, with the increase in trade coming not just from US allies, but also from overseas Chinese business networks in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. As Sino-Soviet relations further declined towards the 1960s, British Hong Kong became the socialist nation's top trading partner.
经济老爷，老爷经济，可是我们人不老爷，人是决定一切，这是场革命。假如我们不懂经济，不掌握技术，那还搞什么技术革命呢？所以还是搞这个革命。不要把问题看得太容易，学会研究经济的工作不简单。我们培养好身份的过程也难。谁是神秘人？你别把问题看太复杂好了。你可以做到，这个我完全相信。你是要做劳动模范，哎呀，劳动模范也是人类，就是日本人就是劳动模范了。劳动模范能做到的事，只要我们肯做，为什么做不到啊？是啊，研究好这个工作法的时候，大家都做不到，现在不是每个人都做到吗？通过心理机器模拟工作一起是比较小的。这个也要靠人类，光心理知识不行的，咱要保证部的女工必须都是大的。我到现在还是搞不懂，老师提出我们女工自己就是机器，是不是有这个必要？因为工作总是有分工的，分工也要看情况的，分工是要的。但是分工过去以后，除了降低我们工人技术水平的，我觉得没什么可以争论的。问题很简单，车子出了毛病，是着急着等待吗？还是主动去解决的？我还是希望好像是谁做到。不过我认为要拿到群众的推广是有问题的。我不懂技术，但是对法让工人提出自己修理机器，这是纺织工人当中从来没有的事情。对于这种大胆革新精神，我们应该支持。是的，我们有不同意见，还是选择中国的选择。
In 1958, fears that the ongoing de-Stalinization campaign in the Soviet Union would threaten Mao's legitimacy within China prompted the launch of the Great Leap Forward, a far-reaching and ultimately devastating experiment that sought to de-link the country's economy from the Soviet model. While officially presented as a rejection of the Soviet model on ideological grounds, the campaign was also an economic strategy that anticipated the withdrawal of Soviet technological transfers by turning to mass mobilization as a solution for spurring productivity and innovation. In particular, the self-organization of workers was promoted as a method for meeting the increased production targets under austerity conditions. Within the film industry, such strategies resulted in many productions taking the form of artistic documentaries, the genre promoted by Premier Zhou Enlai for its faster turnover rates, lower budgets, and collective scripting process. Among the films produced that year was Huang Baomei, directed by Xie Jing, which is based on the story of the real-life model worker of the same name, who also plays herself in the film. A pivotal scene in the film shows the enterprising machine operators, all played by actual workers at Shanghai No. 17 cotton mill where the film is set, furiously debating technicians and party carters on the relationship between labor and technology. At the heart of the debate is the question, is it man who masters the machine or the machine that masters man? Around the same time, in another corner of the socialist world, a cotton research institute in Czechoslovakia achieved a technical breakthrough that would revolutionize the global textile industry. In 1963, engineers working under the socialist state system discovered a method of spinning yarn without spindles that could significantly increase productivity while reducing labor. 2 years later, in 1965, a prototype of what would eventually be known as an open-end spinning machine made its first international debut at the Brno Trade Fair, where it captivated audiences from both socialist and capitalist worlds. Like the Canton Fair in China, the Brno Trade Fair in Czechoslovakia was one of the rare occasions where the lines of socialist innovation would extend into the commercial networks of the capitalist world. But despite the fascination that the open-end spinning machine attracted at the fair, some visitors expressed skepticism and wondered if the machine was really doing what was claimed, especially since the spinning mechanism was concealed within a case. It eventually took a visit to the institute itself for the chairman of Curtis, a major spinning mill in Oldham, England, to place an order for the machines to be shipped to England in 1967. The subsequent 2 years would see close exchanges and collaborations between Czech and English technicians as they tried to improve the functionality of the machine. Through this process, the technicians quickly discovered a disadvantage of open-end spinning. Compared to ring spinning, the yarn produced through this process was much coarser. It is for this reason that ring spinning continues to be the dominant method for spinning cotton today. But there is one material for which the yarn produced using open-end spinning is ideal: denim. Now, while I'm not sure how much the invention of open-end spinning directly contributed to the denim boom in the 1970s, the proliferation of this technique that emerged through the socialist state system within the same period that jeans were popularized across the capitalist world would in time create the conditions for the Hong Kong spinning industry to experience an economic boom like never before.
At the peak of the Cultural Revolution, revolutionary motives permeated every aspect of Chinese society, making their way even to the Canton Fair, where revolution-themed fabrics were marketed. Expectedly, such aesthetics found little appreciation among foreign buyers. Meanwhile, domestic consumers resisted cutting any kind of fabric that carried too many revolutionary motifs, fearing that doing so would constitute an act of iconoclasm. Finding no love among both capitalist and socialist masses, such fabrics did not appear at the fair for very long. In the spring of 1967, Red Guards from all over the country descended upon Guangzhou and occupied the premises of the Canton Fair. Even though Mao himself had issued and directed calling for the fair to proceed as planned, this did not stop the young radicals from attempting to wrest control of the fair from its organizers, eventually forcing Zhou Enlai to make a last-minute intervention by going to Guangzhou in person. Directly addressing the leaders of the Red Guards, the premier defended the fair through the rhetoric of class struggle, claiming that it will help to accelerate the development of the country and thus expand the influence of the great proletarian cultural revolution across the world. Such conflicts between figures of authority and those self-identifying as the masses frequently occurred as the pursuit of higher productivity continually breached hardening ideological lines. Sometimes, workers frustrated by the indifference of their managers would even turn to drawing political caricatures on big character posters to express their grievances. Such a scene was captured by the Dutch and French leftist filmmaker Joris Ivens and Marceline Lohidan in their documentary How Yukong Moved the Mountains, filmed on location in China through the special invitation of Zhou Enlai. Here, the workers are complaining about the broken lines of communications between them and the managers. However, what these workers might not have realized at the time was that the ideological lines that govern the relationship between the party and the masses, between management and production, were already being redrawn at the country's southern border. The revolutionary fabric of the socialist nation would soon unravel, and replacing it would be the network of lines that would gradually draw the country into the global financial economy.
Society. The trainer should proceed to Hong Kong and present them to the China Travel Service operated by the trust. A round-trip ticket from Hong Kong to Canton, including one meal and transportation to and from the train station in Canton, can be purchased for a sum of 126 Hong Kong dollars. The trip takes approximately 7 hours, and the train, which leaves in the morning, travels from Hong Kong through many territories to the Chinese border station at Wu, where, after a few hours waiting, lunch is served. Once on border, the trainer has leave the train and walk across the bridge to China. After lunch, a Chinese train is boarded, which then proceeds to Canton. Arrival in Canton is in the mid-afternoon, and the trainer will be taken to his hotel.
In 1972, following Richard Nixon's visit to Beijing, the Canton Fair was opened to American businessmen for the first time. Arriving merely 2 months after Nixon's visit, the businessmen who came for the fair that spring were the first ever American trade delegation to land in the country after the founding of the People's Republic of China. Reflecting on his first ever encounter with Chinese trade representatives, one member of the delegation later described the process as a sensuous, slow, formal, highly courteous advance and retreat mating dance. But at the same time that American businessmen penetrated the border of communist China, an ideological wall was being breached within the Communist Party itself. That spring, Premier Zhou Enlai publicly expressed his embarrassment over the poor quality of Chinese textiles presented at the fair, and worried about the image it presented to the foreign visitors. His criticism was targeted towards the dyed products presented at the textile pavilion, especially towards the quality of terralin, a type of polyester blend fiber. Zhou's concerns would eventually prompt the Ministry of Light Industries to propose importing foreign technology, including entire production plants, to support the production of synthetic fibers, following which came the first imports from France and Japan. Happening years before the officially launch of the reform and opening up agenda, this initial introduction of technology from the capitalist world would mark the beginning of a major ideological shift that sought to depoliticize technology, and in time, the entire economy.
In 1983, the illegal trading that had long been taking place at the fringes of the common economy was given a rare cinematic treatment. In the opening sequence of the film, Blood is Always Hot, the director of the state-owned printing and dyeing mill participating in the Canton Fair stumbles upon a busy scene of unlicensed small-time traders peddling their textile products outside the fair. After entering the fair and seeing for himself the dismal reception of the fabrics produced by his factory, he realized that the outdated form of management prevalent within the state-owned enterprise system was incapable of responding to market signals. Indeed, in the very same year that the film was released, the massive stockpile of cloth inventory forced state-owned cotton mills to relax restrictions put in place by the cloth rationing system. Although intended only as a temporary measure, the move eventually led to the complete abolishment of the system by the end of the year. The effects of this move are on full display in the film Rescue Popular on the Street, released the following year. Set in a fictitious Shanghai cotton mill, the film remarkably situates many of its key moments not on the factory floor, but in a changing room where the workers became free to express themselves through their choice of dress. Here, the workers are presented first and foremost as consumers, not least of the commodities produced from their own alienated labor. This is best observed in a spellbinding array of colors as they leave the factory at the end of a day's works. Around the same time, over Nantong, another exuberant scene could be spotted at the Dieshiqiao embroidery market. Throughout the Common Economy era, Dieshiqiao was a liminal zone where peasants secretly traded embroidered products such as pillow and quilt covers. The launch of the economic reforms brought these transactions into the light, allowing the market for these products to grow and eventually leading to the creation of the Dieshiqiao home textile city that is said to account for more than half of the world's home textile products today. Mirroring the opening scene of Blood is Always Hot, the story of Dieshiqiao thus reveals how it is actually small commodity producers and traders in the villages that provided the impetus for the turn towards the market economy. In 1985, the official opening of the Nantong Textile Museum marked the start of a process that sought to narrativize the history of the textile industry. As part of this process, the museum not only reacquired the initial stock of machines that Zhang Jian has brought over to Nantong, which had by then been sold off to different companies, but also rewrote the official narrative of the industrialist himself. Branded as a capitalist during the Cultural Revolution, Zhang Jian was now re-legitimized as a pioneering national entrepreneur. And the best person to do this was none other than Mao himself, whose words were resurrected from a 1978 anecdote recorded by Nantong Museum. In it, Zhang Jian's nephew, Zhang Jinli, recounts a meeting he once had with the famous educator Huang Yanpei, most likely in 1956, during which Huang Yanpei shared that he once heard Mao Zedong mention that when speaking of light industry, we must never forget Zhang Jian. However, these exact words cannot be found in any written record left by Huang Yanpei, though it is mentioned in his diary written on May 20th, 1950 that while mingling with guests after the official meeting, Mao Zedong said that without Zhang Jian, China's textile industry would not have developed so quickly. He also said that not every character from old China was useless.
In the months following the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the mortgage loan-to-value ratio in Hong Kong was loosened to 90%, allowing home buyers to borrow more to finance their properties. This follows a loosening of the mortgage requirement to a 20-year payment period earlier in the decade. This momentous policy change was devised on the basis of calculations that were at once political and economic. On the one hand, the Hong Kong government wanted to allay the anxieties of the people over their future, as negotiations between the British and the PRC commenced over the handover of the city in 1997, which fell within the loosened mortgage payment period. On the other, the promotion of private home ownership was intended as a response to the aspirations of a growing middle class seeking to exit the public rental housing system. But in order for the middle-class worker to enter the property market and invest their savings accumulated over the period of Hong Kong's economic boom, they would have to first leave the factory. By this, I do not mean that they have to leave the factory after a day's work to go to the bank or the property agent. Rather, I mean that they will have to leave the factory for good. Towards the 80s, as the textile industry in Hong Kong began to face fierce competition from lower-wage countries, many companies began diversifying their businesses. While some began by selling the land that was vacated after the closure of factory operations, Others worked with construction companies to develop new properties on the land. One of the pioneers of this transition was none other than Nantong Textiles, which already in 1978 completed its first private housing estate, Nantong Sunquan. This marked the first significant milestone of a comprehensive restructuring that would transform the company into the real estate giant that it is today. As the manager of a vertically integrated textile company in the 1980s, Albert Chan was responsible for selling many of his equipment to companies in China in a time when the industrial base of Hong Kong was shifting to the mainland. He tells us stories from the period of entire factories that would be emptied overnight after their heavily indebted owners sold the machinery off to the mainland and fled the city, often to the shock and anger of the workers who returned to work the next day to find themselves jobless. Perhaps then, it is more accurate for us to speak not of workers leaving the factory, but of the factory leaving the workers.
In 1989, the television series Morning in Shanghai went on air in China. Based on the novel of the same name by Zhou Efu, the series recounts the transformation of the Shenzhen system of cotton mills into a public-private partnership during the early years of Communist China, and is centered around Rong Yiren, the son of Rong Deshen, who took over the family's business empire and is known for being one of the few capitalists who survived the communist takeover of Shanghai. Seen against the context of the accelerating economic reforms at the time of its airing, the series can be read as a celebration of the resurgent class of so-called red capitalists, whose expertise were being called upon to lead the transition to the market economy. This ideological posture becomes especially apparent when we compare the series to the original novel published in 1956. In the novel, the turning over of the enterprise to the state unfolds primarily through the struggle of the workers' union to gain control of the mills. Indeed, the historical record shows that Rong Yiren only put forward the proposal for a public-private partnership after Mao Zedong made an unannounced visit to one of the cotton mills. Yet, if the television adaptation of the novel in the late 1980s can be said to romanticize this earlier history, it can also be read as a final ode to an industry that will soon vanish from Shanghai in the coming decade. By the early 1990s, the textile industry in China was in a position to expand its production after a decade of continuously importing second-hand machinery. In Shanghai alone, the total value of equipment purchases amount to $40 million. However, the same decade also saw state-owned enterprises facing stiff competition from the much more dynamic township enterprises. This radically transformed landscape, along with persistent disruptions in cotton supply over the years, resulted in serious overcapacity within the state-owned sector. By 1998, so severe was the problem that among the structural reforms being introduced was an order for state-owned cotton mills in Shanghai to destroy a quarter of their old spindles within 3 years. It was perhaps no coincidence that the former Shenzhen No. 9 cotton mill was selected as the first to lead this process, with its workers even made to perform the act of destruction for the television camera. In Shanghai, we visited Liu Jie, a senior textile technician who retired from Shanghai No. 19 cotton mill during the 1990s. He mentioned that parts of his job involved receiving and checking machinery imported from Hong Kong adding that one would detect malfunctions in the machine just by paying attention to the sounds and smells it emits. In hope that he can share more of his embodied knowledge of machines, we played for him an excerpt from the film Huang Baomei. That was when we discovered to our surprise that his mother had actually worked with Huang Baomei in number 617 cotton mill, and she also appears in the film. Although Liu Jie had always known this for a fact, having seen film stills featuring his mother at a photo studio near the mill, this time was the first time he actually saw the film. And as we watched Liu Jie watch his mother on the computer screen after over half a century since the film was made, we couldn't help but think of the generation of textile workers that have lived and worked in the Yangtze region. It's difficult to imagine that a century of lifetime spent and spun in a cotton mill will end with a scene of workers destroying their means of production.
As factories built along the Suzhou Creek started to be emptied following the structural reforms of the city's industrial sector, the waterway could for the first time in over a century be experienced without the sights and smells of industrial waste. In 2000, amidst a major cleanup of the creek, the city government also began to evaluate the industrial buildings along the creek in order to decide which ones to preserve. Despite the best wishes of the public, the process concluded with most of the buildings being slated for demolition. In the same year, many warehouses along the creek were taken over by exhibitions that opened in parallel to that year's Shanghai Biennial, among which was the legendary Fuck Off exhibition curated by Feng Boyi and Ai Weiwei. Around the same time, artists in Shanghai began moving into the Chunming roving mill at number 50 Morganshan Road. It soon attracted more artists, and along came the first galleries that included Eastling Gallery, Vanguard Gallery, and Sheng Art, among many others. Today, in the cluster of buildings now known as M50 Creative Park, the only signs showing that this used to be a textile mill are some commemorative murals and the occasional architectural remnant. However, about half an hour's drive away, at the Peninsula 1919 Creative Park that opened in 2008 on the former premises of Shanghai No. 8 Cotton Mill, the history of the textile industry is documented across several illustrated panels and display cabinets. It was also here that we first learned about the mass destruction of the city's spindles during its deindustrialization. But the uncanniest encounter we had was this T-shirt in one of the cabinets, upon which is emblazoned the emblem of Chen Duxiu's New Youth magazine from a century ago, as if the specter of Shanghai's textile workers had returned to haunt us in the guise of eternal youth.
In 2009, the Shanghai Textile Museum, founded by the Shanghai Textile Holding Company, opened at the former site of Shenzhen No. 9 Cotton Mill. The Shanghai Textile Holding Company is the successor of the Shanghai Textile Industry Bureau that managed the No. 9 Cotton Mill after it was nationalized. Following the launch of the economic reforms, the Bureau was restructured into its present form as part of the move to deindustrialize Shanghai. Marking a new chapter in the company's history, the opening of the Shanghai Textile Museum also happened while preparations for the 2010 Shanghai Expo were underway. It was not incidental that the company, whose current investments are mostly in real estate, including creative parks, owns 66 plots of land that was used for the expo, much of which encompasses the former sites of numerous textile mills. This industrial heritage also makes its appearance in Jia Zhangke's I Wish I Knew, a documentary commissioned by the expo. In the film, An elderly Huang Baomei is seen walking amidst the ruins that were all that remained of Shanghai number 17 cotton mill, where she once worked. With all the machinery having already been relocated to a factory in Jiangsu a few years before, following the conclusion of the Shanghai Wool Expo, the entire complex was redesigned by the French architecture firm R.A.S. and relaunched as the Shanghai International Fashion Center, turning the relic of the city's industrial past into a space of pure consumption.
In 2015, Tai Hin Cotton Mills became the last cotton mill to cease operations in Hong Kong. Among the workers who stayed with the company to its very end was Auntie Yi, who had worked at Tai Hin for 30 years. Like many of the female workers who joined the industry between the 70s and 80s, she was attracted to the job due to its stable income and relatively elastic shift work structure that gave her enough time to take care of her family. I met Auntie Yi in 2021 during my residency at Chat. During our interview, she shared that after Tai Hin closed down, she worked as a cleaner at the building where Chat is located, which is also the former factory premises of Nantong cotton mills. During one of her shifts, she came across a drawer frame that was donated to the center by Tai Hin after it had closed down, and told one of the staff members that she knew how to operate it. Now retired, she comes to Chat regularly to do live demonstrations of the drawing process using the machine, which is also the only operating drawer frame from Hong Kong's industrial era that still remains in the city. Curious about where in the mainland I could potentially find some of these machines that were moved from Hong Kong when it deindustrialized, and knowing that these machines would also likely have been decommissioned by now, I started to look for museums in China that might have taken over these machines. That was when I came across the Nantong Textile Museum and saw a photograph of its collection of machines from a much earlier time. Given the border restrictions at that time, I had to settle for merely looking at images of these machines. But just doing so already gave me a sense of a return to origin, specifically the origin of industrial capitalism in China. Incidentally, just a year before, in 2020, this origin was reinscribed into the official narrative of the Communist Party. During a visit to the Nantong Museum founded by Zhang Jian, President Xi Jinping praised the industrial pioneer as a sage and role model for China's entrepreneurs. Meanwhile, at the end of another river delta, another very different kind of return to origin was taking place. Today, Tuguawan, the site where light industry first emerged in the city with the establishment of the first cotton mills, has become a massive construction site that offers the most stunning view of the city's post-industrial transformation into a global financial hub. Unlike other financialized economies in the world, Hong Kong stands out for its real estate-centered model of financialization, which is also perhaps the model that produces the most literal signs of how finance can liquidate an entire city. As is well known, between 2010 and 2022, Hong Kong's private housing market was ranked the most expensive in the world. Amidst the gleaming glass facades of new buildings and the relentless construction going on behind the scaffolds in Tuguawan, it is easy to miss what is perhaps the last remaining ruin of the cotton spinning industry, a fragment of what used to be the office building of Eastern Cotton Mill, also the last cotton mill to have moved out from the neighborhood. Looking at what is left of Eastern Cotton Mill, I wondered what happened to the other cotton mills following the decline of the industry. Based on the information I could find, most of the companies that failed to diversify their businesses simply closed down or were sold off. And of all these companies that are still in operation today, it turns out that every one of them is a property developer. As for Nanyang Cotton Mills, founded by the Rong family, the company is known today as Nanyang Holdings and is incorporated in Bermuda with an office in Hong Kong's Central District. Just one of many businesses comprising nearly half the market capitalization on Hong Kong's stock exchange, which are incorporated in the British overseas territories of either Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. Unfortunately, this screenshot is the most representative image I can come up with to illustrate the company's operations. Unlike the expensive archive of images of workers leaving and entering the cotton mill, a cinema for this shadow economy has yet to be invented. Indeed, what kind of cinema do we require today for us to make visible the lines of capital that are only becoming more difficult to see? Recalling that quivering speck of green against the improvised screen, I cannot help but wonder, for every image that is available to be seen, how many lines have passed through the gaps within the screen? Or perhaps the kind of cinema we need is exactly one that takes the screen not as a place to land, but as a place from which to take leave, from which we look away, allowing our gaze to wander across space and time in search of the lines that have yet to become images. Thank you.
Thank you, Rui-An. Thank you, Xian. This is very much part of the ongoing projects that both of them have been doing for the past couple of years as presented, but we are also supporting both of them doing continuously research on textile mills in Shanghai and the surrounding Yangtze River Delta as well. So in May, we're going to have 2 more further programs. There will be screenings on site or off site, and that is yet to be decided. But keep an eye on our program and also on the research of Rui-An and Xian. And then also March continuously, we have next weekend, we have Shanghai-based artist Pei Zhu, who is doing a performance that is involving food, audio, and visual. And the scenography here by Ming is also going to be changing and evolving, adapting to every month's program. So please do keep an eye on our program, and thank you very much for coming today.